when we use ChatGPT, we think that the promise we're made is that we will be receiving communication, we'll be receiving information, but by using the product, we're providing OpenAI with language that is very valuable to it, that it can use to continue to train its models, and we're providing it with information about us.
Hello and welcome to another special episode of The Boss's Code. Have you considered the tools that you use every day? I mean the digital tools, internet search, social media apps, chat GPT, and the various AI chatbots that are floating around the app stores these days. And have you thought what happens to you when you communicate with them and through them? Are you really in control of your communication, or are you losing ground to these tools? And what are you becoming in the process? This is the area I'd like to probe with my guest today, Vauhini Vara, whose recent book, Searches, has made a deep impact on me. Vauhini is a writer, journalist, and an editor whose work have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and The New York Times. She's written extensively about big tech firms. In fact, she started a career as a tech reporter at the Wall Street Journal and has also interviewed Sam Altman, the co-founder of OpenAI. And I'm super excited to have her on the program. Vauhini, welcome to the Boss's Club.
Thanks for having me, John.
So, Vauhini, I'd like to start off this conversation from your book Searches, right? I think it's about a 6-year project for you in multiple different phases. And during this period is also when we had OpenAI kind of tinkering with the GPT models. We had the GPT-2, and then you had a chance to, I think, test GPT-3, if I'm not wrong, you write about it in the book. And you get a sense of how things are moving up. And then we have now moved to a stage where we are at GPT-5, we have Grok, we have Claude, so many other tools. So tell me about the journey, how this whole experience has been writing Searches.
So I think of the book as not being necessarily about AI as much as it's about our relationship with big technology companies' products and the way their products mediate communication and ultimately change the way that we express ourselves. And one could argue in the process, change our identities, our selfhood. Um, AI has been, especially recently, has played a big role in that. I think it's sort of supercharged everything that tech companies have been doing up until this point. And so it's been interesting to see the models evolve because I think at first, the companies and organizations behind AI products like large language models weren't really trying to figure out yet what the product was that they were building. They just were investing in an interesting technology and trying to make it better. And so early on, there was something sort of wild and interesting about the way in which the models functioned. And then over time, as they became productized in the form of things like ChatGPT and Grok and Gemini, it became very clear that the companies behind these products were trying to build products essentially. And so they were molding the technology to their desired goals, which was to have successful companies.
Yeah, the idea that a lot of people didn't know about ChatGPT until the early 2023, but the tool itself was launched in 2022. But you had a glimpse, or rather, you kind of worked on it in some form or the other, even before that launch happened.
Yeah, it wasn't even ChatGPT actually. So in 2020, I got access to the model you mentioned earlier, GPT-3, right? Which was a predecessor to the models that underlie ChatGPT. So basically, when OpenAI started working on large language models, they built something that was just called GPT, as you know, John. And then after that, it was GPT-2, and then after that, it was GPT-3. And at some point, starting around the GPT-2 era, the company started giving access to these models to researchers, also to journalists to play around and see how they functioned. I had written a profile of Sam Altman, now the CEO of OpenAI, in 2017, and had been following OpenAI at least since then. And so when I was reading about these models, I became intrigued both as a journalist, but also as a creative writer. And in 2020, wrote to Sam Altman and said, "Hey, can I try this model out? I've heard about this GPT-3 thing you're working on, and I know you're giving access to it to journalists. Can I be one of them?" And ultimately, the company agreed and gave me access to this early model called GPT-3. The reason I make the distinction between that and ChatGPT is that the way those two models, that model and the new ones function, were very, very different. So the way in which that model functioned was that you would give it text, hit a button, and then it would generate text in which the company behind the model's goal was to match somewhat the style and the substance of the text that had been given. And so what you could do is give it all kinds of sort of different kinds of text and play around with it to see how successfully the model was matching the input, right? What I did was think about, as a tech journalist, I'm always trying to understand like what the promise is that these companies are making. And it seemed clear that the promise that OpenAI might make with the product like this was that it could produce language for people when they were at a loss for language, right? And especially sort of tantalizingly produce language in a particular style. And so what that meant was that hypothetically, I, as a writer, could type anything into into GPT-3, hit a button, and then it would produce all this text that sounded somewhat like me. So I started thinking about like why I would use a product like this. As a writer, I typically don't find myself at a loss for words. But there was one thing, and continues to be one thing in my life, that I struggle to write about, to talk about, which is the death of my sister when we were in college. My sister had cancer, and she died. And so I went to GPT-3 and I asked it, I gave it some language about my sister and her death and my grief over it. And I pressed this button to see if it could write something about my sister's death and my grief over it. And at first, it produced something that like had nothing to do with me, nothing to do with my sister. It created this text that suggested that my sister was still alive. And then I thought, okay, well, what if I write more? Then surely this product will be able to match more closely what I intend. And so I did that. And as I went on with this process, I found that the more I wrote, the more convincingly this product matched something of the style and substance of my writing about my sister. And yet it never actually got there. And so ultimately, I realized through this process that this product is not actually capable of doing the thing, of course, that I thought it might promise that it could do. Interestingly, maybe OpenAI discovered that too. I think really what OpenAI discovered was that like that particular use case was a really tiny use case that probably didn't have a lot of financial promise. And they realized that determined that the most financially promising business model, would actually be to start AI chatbots that could follow instructions. And so the reason I make the distinction between the model I use and the models that exist now is that the models that exist now are not built to do the thing that GPT-3 did. They're not really built to match the style and substance of the text it's given. What ChatGPT and Gemini and so on do are those models are fine-tuned to behave in a very specific way. What ChatGPT says, what OpenAI says, is that ChatGPT should behave a bit like a coworker, and they're talking specifically, one imagines, about like a white-collar American user of American English, coworker in some kind of office setting, maybe in Silicon Valley, right? There's a very specific way that ChatGPT produces language. And so ChatGPT would not be able to do the thing that GPT-3 was able to do with the text I provided. It functions very differently. So I feel lucky that I got to use this product that's sort of a remnant of a time when OpenAI was more exploratory and creative in how it was thinking about
Right.
models.
I mean, two interesting strands. I mean, to come from that idea that you're kind of building on. One is you mentioned that when you actually came across some sort of a tool that is there on the market like this, the first thing that we want to do is something that we are unable to express. I mean, we want to take something more
Yeah.
personal to us, and then we want to put it out there, right? So the idea that actually comes into our mind is there's some kind of a privacy involved there. So we could
Yeah.
actually provide some sacred information to us that we can have communication with, which is what is largely happening now when you see this whole set of news that comes out where people are sharing their psychological needs to these chatbots. So, what could this mean? And the other aspect is when you look at this particular tool that is currently available with people, what amount of data that is going to be sitting with these large companies, and how can this be manipulated, right?
Yeah.
Could you, give a sense on, how these things are playing out?
Yeah. I mean, one thing I think is kind of fascinating is the way in which anytime you take one of the promises that these tech companies make, if you turn it around, you can see how that promise is inverted in a way. So, for example, Google promises to give us the world's information, but by using the product, we are actually providing Google with more information about us collectively than Google will allow, will give us. Similarly, when we use ChatGPT, we think that the promise we're made is that we will be receiving communication, we'll be receiving information, but by using the product, we're providing OpenAI with language that is very valuable to it that it can use to continue to train its models, and we're providing it with information about us, similarly to when we use Google. So as you point out, there's something insidious there because the thing that the companies say they're giving us are actually the thing they're extracting from us. And I think with chatbots, what's especially troubling is that the companies behind these products have built the products to use rhetoric, to use language in a very, very specific way, that is meant to make us feel safe, that is meant to make us feel trusting. This is language that the companies themselves use in describing what they want their products to do. So this isn't my hypothesis. This is what the companies claim about their products. And so you build these products that talk to people in a way that's intended to get them to feel safe and trusting and therefore willing to share information. The question then becomes, well, with Google, for example, with Meta, we understand now something of how the companies benefit from having that information. Companies like, I mean, OpenAI, for example, does not yet monetize its free. It's just starting to figure out how to monetize its free users. But that company is spending a lot of money to provide its product to us, and investors are putting a bunch of money into this company with the assumption that at some point they're going to get a return on their investment. And the only way for OpenAI to do that will be, and again, the company has said that they need to figure out how to monetize those free users. The most obvious way that any tech company with a free product monetizes its users is by extracting their information and finding a way to monetize that. And OpenAI and other companies are now talking about putting advertising in some form into their products. And so you end up with a product that not only knows about us, but knows what kind of language to use with each of us in order to make us feel safe, make us feel trusting, potentially persuade us. I say potentially because the company has said explicitly that these companies say explicitly that they're trying to build products that aren't too persuasive. But there is also some research that should suggest that either they're not trying that hard or it's a really intractable problem because the products are persuasive. And so that's the challenge. You end up with, you or I are not feeling well, and we go to ChatGPT and ask what product we over the counter product we should take, pharmaceutical we should take in order to feel better. And one can hypothetically imagine a world in which the top results that we get from ChatGPT, the top suggestions, are actually from the companies that are paying it. and it's presented to us as if these are the best options.
It's quite unclear how they're going to monetize from this because we have seen, I think, in one of your recent articles on New York Times, you point out I mean, at least the last two waves, one with just after the dot-com boom around when Google search actually comes into the picture. And then the next one is the social media with Facebook coming up. And then both of these companies hit at the time when the market is down, and then they say that they want to make some money so that they sustain themselves, and that's when they kind of switch to advertising. And you point out that the
Yeah.
same thing is happening to OpenAI. So what do you think would be the next way through which these firms would get into a monetization? So are there any
Yeah.
specific models that you're coming across these companies are tinkering with, experimenting?
Yeah. Well, OpenAI has Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, as well as the CFO, have made small comments here and there about the prospect of advertising. What Sam Altman has spoken about most specifically is the prospect of essentially having pay OpenAI a small amount anytime an OpenAI product such as ChatGPT recommends the product. And so, in Sam Altman's conception, as I understand it, the model wouldn't be tinkered with to recommend product A over product B because product A has paid OpenAI. However, if OpenAI through ChatGPT happens to recommend product A and product A, the maker of product A has some kind of deal with ChatGPT with OpenAI would get a small percentage of the sale of that product or something like that. It's all very vague right now, but I think what I understand is that Sam Altman understands the problematic nature of AI and of advertising in chatbots. Sam Altman also is beholden to OpenAI's shareholders who need to see some kind of return on their investment. And so I think he's like, they're all trying to thread that needle. How can we integrate basically what regular people would call advertising without calling it advertising, without feeling that our product is being compromised, without users feeling that our product is being compromised? I think that's the tricky thing that they're trying to navigate because I don't know that it's easy to do both at the same time.
So it's definitely a new medium through which they don't want to, see how the monetization aspect really kind of kicks in. Of course, there's a
Yeah.
subscription model that each of these players are trying to push. So how do you see the capabilities of these models kind of, increasing over the years? And how should people be thinking about a future in which these kind of chatbots are going to be more of the norm than, it's becoming more like a Google search back in the mid 2000s when everybody started to
Yeah.
use the search engines. So we are kind of moving into a phase where chatbots would be the norm through which people access the internet. So, given your experience on experimenting these things, how do you think people should be looking at the world, maybe next couple of years on how this thing would develop?
It's what I find interesting is that I think our impression as a society of how prevalent AI use is sort of overblown. I was looking at some numbers recently, mostly in the US. And I would have guessed if you asked me that maybe more than 60% of people in the US had used a chatbot ever. The number is actually around a third. The figure is actually around a third. And now we're about 3 years into ChatGPT launched about 3 years ago. So I think we're still at this potential inflection point in which people here in the US where I live or globally as well can decide what kind of future we want and what the potential role of AI chatbots or not should be. And that's what I find kind of exciting about this moment because I think we were all kind of blindsided by Google search. We were all kind of blindsided by social media. But I think all of us are sort of more literate now about these products, the financial interest behind the proliferation of these products. And I think hopefully are better equipped now than we were in the age of Google's rise or Meta's rise to make decisions for ourselves about personal use of these products, the policies that our governments make around these products. And so, it's also the case that like there's no way of knowing what the future holds. And I think it's very much in the company's interest to say, hey, we're definitely moving into a future in which there's considerably more use of our products and that our products are going to get better. Um, but I think the recent release of GPT-5, OpenAI's most recent language model, the column that says, listen, maybe the companies say that their products are going to get better and better because it serves their interest, not because they necessarily know that that's the case. Because the OpenAI kept saying GPT-5 would be considerably better than GPT-4. And, results so far seem to suggest that it's maybe worse, it's maybe a little better, it's maybe the same, but there hasn't been some great leap forward. And so I don't think anybody has any way of knowing sort of what the future of these products is. And so far, certainly, it seems that they've been underwhelming. So in corporate context, for example, companies that are using AI have tended to find that it's not actually delivering that much value. I've written about AI in education, and teachers seem to have found that it's not delivering that much value. And so we can guess that maybe something's going to change and there's going to be, an explosion in value. But it's just as easy to imagine that that's not going to happen, and we're in a bubble that's going to burst.
In fact, you also touched upon the policy angle. I'd like for you to, step into that zone for a bit, kind of contrasting between how policies around technology and AI are kind of shaping up, both in the US and the Europe. Because you mentioned the point where you kind of land in Spain and then you try to open up a map, but Google Maps isn't opening. And that's
Yeah.
when you realize that the Digital Markets Act there. So because of that, you can't kind of front load a particular app in a device. So how do you
Yeah.
kind of contrast these two? Because in the US, tech companies are given a free ride, right? I mean, there's no regulation. People can
Yeah.
go and do whatever they want. So when you contrast these two models, how, I mean, where will we find common ground in the future? Would there be any kind of values-driven tech innovation at all in future, or would it be more like the Silicon Valley style?
I mean, I think ultimately it depends on who is behind the technology, right? Be the case that that AI is built by the private sector, then the values behind the development of that technology are going to be the values of the private sector. And I think the private sector here in the US and Silicon Valley is getting better and better at being persuasive, not just to US politicians and policymakers, but elsewhere as well, including in Europe. Um, and so historically, certainly, Europe has been more conservative than the US or rather more protective of the rights of users than US policymakers. But it seems that, I mean, these companies have a lot of money and a lot of smart people working for them. And it seems that they are working to figure out what the sticking points are in Europe, what they might be able to say to be more persuasive in Europe and trying to employ those strategies. And so it may be the case that they're more successful now than they've been in the past. But like I said, that's describing a world in which technology is driven by the companies themselves. One can imagine a world in which technologies are built not by the private sector, but by communities, by under nonprofit models, by governments to an extent, to the extent that governments are building technologies in a way that's intended to serve their constituents, which is, there's a question mark around that. But, in a world in which technologies are built to serve some other need other than a profit motive, one can imagine technologies being built to serve those needs. In a world in which the primary motive is to turn a profit, it's unclear why those companies would be compelled or incentivized to do otherwise. And because they have so much money, it can be difficult to imagine what the counterweight to that would be when it comes to lobbying in the US and Europe and in Asia. So it puts us sort of in a difficult, intractable position because it's so expensive to make these products currently.
Absolutely. And I think also what the other important aspect in this whole increase in the size of these private companies that are holding so much at stake in terms of technology, a lot of academic institutions which used to be the pioneers in these technologies don't have the similar amount of resources anymore to kind of, build such large systems to kind of test and do things. So
Yeah.
research is starting to kind of invert and become more a function of private enterprise versus public universities. So there was another statistics that I got to know that about 70% of the PhD graduates in the US at least are now moving to private enterprises after their graduation versus 30% about 15 years ago. So
Yeah.
that's a big change. And if more talent is actually going to build these things for private companies, so it's going to be a very different future.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. I agree with you.
So let's hope that, in some way things actually, get to a phase where, people start building things for the public good.
Yeah. I mean, I will say it is interesting to imagine. We talked about how expensive it is to build this stuff, which makes it difficult for anyone other than the private sector to do it. But it is true that the costs are falling, and China's DeepMind showed that you can actually build a well-functioning model using fewer resources than the U.S. companies have been using. And so, if that's true, if that holds, if that price, the cost of building the stuff continues to fall, then you can imagine a potential world in which actually you don't have to be a really well-funded private company in order to build AI, and then it gets kind of interesting.
Great. I think on that note, we could, come to a close. Thanks so much for taking the time, Vauhini,
Thank
and
you,
hope
John. It was
to
really good
stay in
talking to you.
touch.